I sat in the cab of my truck, watching the exhaust plume curl into the freezing November air. It was exactly 6 in the morning on a Sunday. The suburban street was entirely quiet, the kind of heavy, undisturbed silence that only exists in wealthy neighborhoods before the sun comes up. Through the frost-edged windshield, I kept my eyes fixed on the front porch of the colonial revival house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The porch light was still on, casting a pale yellow glow over the manicured frost on the lawn. A few seconds later, 2 local police cruisers turned the corner, their tires crunching softly against the iced asphalt. They did not have their sirens on. They parked neatly along the curb. 2 officers stepped out, followed by a man in a grey overcoat holding a leather briefcase. His name was Ian, and he was a commercial fraud investigator for a major underwriting firm. As the 3 men walked up the paved driveway toward Diane's front door, I rolled my window down just an inch, letting the biting cold slip into the heated cabin. I did not want to miss the sound of the doorbell. To understand how we arrived at this frozen morning, you have to understand the specific weight of family guilt and how easily it can be weaponized by someone who knows exactly where your fractures are. My name is Arthur. I run a commercial supply chain logistics company called Talbot Logistics. We manage freight, warehouse distribution, and large-scale procurement for corporate clients across the Midwest. It is a quiet, unglamorous business built on spreadsheets, loading docks, and incredibly thin margins. I built it from the ground up after my father died. When he passed, he left behind a mountain of medical debt and a fractured family. My Aunt Diane, his younger sister, had always positioned herself as the aristocratic branch of our family tree, despite never having worked a day in her life. When my business finally started turning a significant profit in my late 30s, Diane's husband lost everything in a real estate collapse. He passed away shortly after, leaving Diane and her daughter Chloe in a precarious financial state. Because I had succeeded right as they had fallen, Diane subtly and relentlessly cultivated a narrative that I owed them my protection. I internalized that guilt. I paid for Chloe's college tuition. I covered the property taxes on Diane's sprawling house so she wouldn't have to downsize. I convinced myself that this was what a man was supposed to do for his family, ignoring the fact that Diane never once said thank you. When Chloe got engaged to a young man from a very wealthy family, Diane was thrown into a panic. She was terrified that the groom's parents would realize she was essentially living on my charity. She needed to host a wedding that projected immense generational wealth. 10 months ago, Diane invited me to lunch and asked me to serve as the financial guarantor for the wedding. She explained that the venue, a highly exclusive restored shipyard called the Ironworks, required a corporate underwriter for liability reasons because of its historical status. She promised she had the cash to cover the actual costs, heavily implying that the groom's family was contributing a massive sum. She just needed Talbot Logistics on paper to secure the dates and the vendor contracts. I was hesitant, but she looked at me with tears in her eyes, invoking my father's memory, saying that this was the only way Chloe could hold her head high around her new in-laws. Against my better judgment, I signed the initial guarantee authorization. I told my accounting department to flag any charges, expecting nothing to actually hit our accounts. For months, everything seemed perfectly normal. I received no invoices. The wedding planning consumed Diane and Chloe, and I stayed out of it, buried in a massive quarterly acquisition at work. The only thing I knew was that it was going to be an extravagant affair. When the evening of the wedding finally arrived, I put on my best dark suit and drove to the Ironworks. The venue was breathtaking. Massive rusted steel beams arched over exposed brick walls, draped with thousands of cascading white orchids. Waiters in crisp black uniforms circulated with silver trays of champagne. I checked my coat and approached the foyer, where a massive gold-framed mirror was inscribed with the seating chart. I scanned the elegant calligraphy for my name. The head tables, the family tables, the peripheral tables near the back. My name was nowhere on the glass. I stood there for a long moment, the ambient noise of a string quartet washing over me. I assumed there had been a printing error. I walked over to the main hostess, a young woman holding an illuminated tablet, and quietly gave her my name. She frowned, swiped her screen, and then a look of deep discomfort crossed her face. She asked me to follow her. We did not walk into the main dining hall. Instead, she led me down a narrow, unadorned service hallway. The air grew warmer, heavy with the smell of searing meat, reduced wine, and industrial detergents. She pushed open a set of metal double doors, and we stepped into the staging kitchen. It was chaotic, loud, and blindingly bright. Servers were rushing past with stacks of plates. Cooks were shouting orders over the roar of industrial ventilation hoods. In the far corner, near a stack of collapsed cardboard boxes, there was a small stainless steel prep table. A single folding chair was pulled up to it. On the table was a plain white index card with my name printed on it in standard black ink. Next to it was a rolled-up napkin containing standard diner cutlery, not the silver used in the main hall. The hostess could not look me in the eye. She mumbled something about a last-minute adjustment and practically ran back out the doors. I stood alone by the prep table, the heat of the ovens pressing against my back. It was a perfectly executed, surgically precise insult. Diane had not just excluded me, she had physically discarded me into the machinery of the event. She was signaling that to her, I was not family. I was the help. I was the vendor. I was the wallet. My initial instinct was to walk out, drive home, and never speak to her again. But 30 years of running logistics has trained me to suppress emotional reactions in favor of operational assessments. I did not leave. I took off my suit jacket, folded it neatly over the back of the folding chair, and sat down. A few minutes later, an older man with silver hair and a meticulously ironed black apron walked over to the table. He was carrying a clipboard and looked exhausted. He introduced himself as Silas, the catering captain. He looked at me, sitting at his prep table in a tailored suit, and offered a wry, knowing smile. He didn't ask why I was there. He just asked if I wanted a coffee. I told him I would take it black. For the next hour I sat quietly, watching the mechanics of the kitchen. I watched Silas manage the flow of food, the timing of the courses, the constant putting out of fires. It was a beautiful, stressful ballet, and I felt infinitely more comfortable there than I would have in the dining room. As Silas was organizing the final push for the main courses, he set his clipboard down on my table to help a waiter balance a massive tray of prime rib. My eyes naturally drifted to the top sheet of paper. It was the Master Vendor Manifest. My brain processes invoices the way other people read novels. It's automatic. I looked at the billing entity at the top right corner of the page. It did not say Diane Reed. It did not say the name of the groom's family. It read in bold capital letters, Talbot Logistics, Inc. I reached out and pulled the clipboard slightly closer. I looked at the catering cost, $42,000. I looked at the floral budget, $18,000. The equipment rentals, the liability insurance. All of it was billed to an open line of credit under my company's name. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. This was not a case of Diane simply asking me to be a guarantor in case she defaulted. This was an active, executed line of corporate credit. When Silas returned to the table, I asked him, keeping my voice entirely level, who had authorized the billing structure. Silas wiped his brow and said the event planner had handled it, but that all the contracts were secured with a digital corporate seal and a digital signature from the CEO of Talbot Logistics. My signature. I pulled my phone from my pocket and logged into my company's secure financial portal. I bypassed the standard checking accounts and went directly to the corporate credit inquiries. There it was. 7 months ago, a massive umbrella policy had been opened. Not by me. I searched the uploaded documents. Diane had used the initial limited guarantee form I signed to gain access to my company's tax identification number. From there, she had created a shadow email domain that looked identical to my corporate domain, differing by only a single letter. She had spent the better part of a year impersonating my chief financial officer, approving vendor contracts, drawing down on a commercial credit line, and effectively placing $120,000 of debt squarely onto my company's balance sheet. But the real question was why. Diane had explicitly told me the groom's parents were paying for the bulk of the wedding. I opened a new tab and accessed the public property records for our county. I searched Diane's name. Our transaction had cleared just 3 weeks ago. She had purchased a luxury condominium in a highly exclusive retirement community on the coast, paid entirely in cash, $85,000 down. The exact amount the groom's family had supposedly contributed to the wedding. The mechanism of her fraud became instantly clear. She had taken the cash from the groom's family, deposited it into her personal accounts to buy herself a new home, and shifted the entire financial burden of the actual wedding onto my company through identity theft and wire fraud. I did not scream. I did not storm into the dining hall and flip a table. Emotional outbursts are for people who do not have leverage. I had my laptop in my truck. I walked out the back delivery doors, retrieved it from the cab and brought it back to the metal prep table. For the next 3 hours, while the wedding raged on beyond the swinging doors, while the bass from the dance floor vibrated the kitchen walls, I sat with the staff and worked. I called my director of IT, waking him up at 10 at night, and had him trace the IP addresses of the forged emails. They originated from Diane's home network. I pulled every digitally signed contract from the vendor portal. I compiled the metadata. Then I made a phone call to Ian. Ian is an external investigator for the commercial underwriter that secures Talbot Logistics. We play golf twice a year. He is a man who takes commercial fraud very seriously because it directly impacts his firm's exposure. I woke him up, apologized for the hour, and explained the situation. I sent him the compiled data packet directly from the kitchen. Within 40 minutes, Ian confirmed what I already knew. This was not a family dispute. This was a felony. It crossed state lines due to the servers involved, making it federal wire fraud, compounded by commercial identity theft. Around midnight, the kitchen doors swung open, and Diane walked in. She was wearing a custom silk gown that probably cost more than my first car. Her face was flushed with champagne and triumph. She had come to yell at Silas because the late-night dessert station was not being set up fast enough to suit her timeline. She berated Silas for 2 full minutes, treating him like something she had scraped off her shoe. Silas took it with the stoic professionalism of a man who has dealt with 1,000 tyrants before her. As she turned to leave, she finally noticed me sitting in the corner, the blue light of my laptop illuminating my face. She stopped, her eyes narrowing. She walked over, her heels clicking sharply against the grease-stained tiles. She looked at my laptop, then at the index card with my name on it, and let out a soft, pitying laugh. She told me I looked right at home, hiding in the back with the hired help, crunching numbers while the real family celebrated. She said it was a shame I didn't have the social grace to sit in the main hall, but she supposed water always finds its level. I closed my laptop. I looked up at her, making sure my expression was completely blank. I told her I just needed to review the final vendor manifests to ensure the staff was properly compensated for their overtime. I reached out, took Silas's clipboard, and pulled a specific piece of paper from the bottom of the stack. It was a standard venue release form acknowledging that the undersigned took full legal responsibility for the orchestration and authorization of the event's billing. I handed her a pen. I told her that since she was the primary planner, the venue just needed her physical signature to release the kitchen staff for the night. Diane rolled her eyes, snatched the pen, and signed the document without reading a single word. She threw the pen on the table, told me to stay out of the photographs, and walked back into the party. She had just provided a physical, wet ink signature on a document verifying her control over the event's logistics, perfectly tying her physical person to the digital fraud I had already compiled. I handed the clipboard back to Silas. He looked down at the signature, then up at me. He didn't know exactly what I was doing, but he had been around enough wealthy, abusive people to recognize when a trap had been sprung. He gave me a slow, deliberate nod. I packed up my laptop, put my suit jacket back on, shook Silas's hand, and walked out the back door into the freezing night, which brought me to Sunday morning, sitting in my truck outside Diane's house. I watched as Ian pressed the doorbell. He pressed it a second time. A light flipped on in the entryway. The door opened, revealing Diane. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair disheveled, the heavy makeup from the night before smeared around her eyes. Even from the street, I could see the immediate shift in her posture. The annoyance of being woken up vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrified tension when she saw the badges on the 2 officers. Ian stepped forward. He did not yell. He did not make a scene. He simply handed her a thick manila envelope. I knew exactly what was inside. It was a cease and desist order, a commercial injunction freezing all of her personal banking assets, and a formal notification of a criminal investigation into wire fraud and corporate identity theft. The police were not there to drag her out in handcuffs. Not yet. They were there as civil standbys to ensure she surrendered her passport and the digital devices used to commit the fraud, standard procedure when dealing with high-flight risk financial crimes. I opened my truck door and stepped out onto the asphalt. The sound of the door closing echoed down the quiet street. Diane looked past the officers and saw me standing by the hood of my truck. The color completely drained from her face. She tried to step out onto the porch, pointing a trembling finger at me, her voice rising in a shrill, frantic pitch. She started yelling that this was a family matter, that I was confused, that it was just a misunderstanding about the invoices. I walked up the driveway, stopping just behind the officers. I looked at her, standing barefoot on the freezing concrete of her porch. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the exact same tone I used to cancel a delayed freight shipment. I told her there was no misunderstanding. I told her I knew about the shadow domain, the forged signatures, and the cash she had redirected to buy the condominium. I explained that Talbot Logistics was no longer the guarantor of the wedding. Because the contracts were signed fraudulently, the underwriter was retroactively voiding them. The venue, the caterers, the florists, they were all going to wake up this morning realizing they had not been paid. And because Diane had signed the physical release form in the kitchen, acknowledging her orchestration of the event, the vendors would be coming directly after her for the $120,000. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The reality of the math was crashing down on her. Her bank accounts were frozen by the fraud investigation. Her new condominium would be seized as evidence of money laundering. She was going to have to explain to her daughter, and her daughter's new wealthy in-laws, why the police were investigating her, and why the wedding vendors were preparing to sue her into oblivion. She looked at me, her eyes begging for the familiar guilt she had exploited for years. She whispered my name, asking how I could do this to my own family. I looked at the officers, then back at her. I told her she had made it perfectly clear last night. I wasn't family. I was just the guy sitting with the staff in the kitchen. I turned around and walked back down the driveway. I got into my truck, put it in gear, and drove away, leaving her standing on the porch surrounded by the architecture of her own collapse. I drove straight to my warehouse. It was Sunday, so the loading bays were empty and the building was silent. I unlocked the main office, walked into the break room and made a pot of terrible industrial-grade coffee. I sat at my desk, looking out over the rows of pallet racks and forklifts. For years I had carried the weight of my father's debts, trying to buy the respect of a woman who viewed me only as a utility. I had let guilt dictate my boundaries, but sitting there in the quiet warehouse, the smell of cardboard and engine oil hanging in the air, I realized the debt was finally settled. The ghost of my family's past obligations was gone. I took a sip of the bitter coffee, opened my laptop, and began planning the logistics for the week ahead, enjoying the absolute, unbroken silence. The absolute silence of my warehouse on that Sunday morning was a luxury that lasted exactly 24 hours. By Monday at 9 in the morning, the financial shockwave of the cancelled vendor contracts hit the regional banking system, and the fallout was immediate. I was sitting in my glass-walled office overlooking the loading bays when my chief financial officer, David, walked in without knocking. He looked pale. He told me that our primary operating accounts had just been frozen. Not the fraudulent credit line Diane had opened, but the actual legitimate vascular system of Talbot Logistics. I immediately called Ian, the fraud investigator, who had served Diane the papers. Ian sounded exhausted. He explained that Diane had not spent Sunday crying. She had spent it hiring one of the most aggressive corporate defense attorneys in the state. Her lawyer had immediately filed an emergency counter-injunction. Their defense was brazen, but strategically brilliant. They claimed that the shadow email domain was not a forgery created by Diane, but a legitimate subsidiary server authorized by me specifically for the wedding logistics, designed to keep personal expenses separate from corporate taxes. Furthermore, They argued that I was now maliciously defaulting on guaranteed contracts out of a petty family grievance, attempting to frame my aunt to escape the debt. Because Talbot Logistics was technically the guarantor on paper, the judge opted to freeze my operating accounts pending a preliminary hearing to prevent asset flight. Diane had managed to turn my own corporate structure against me. It was a temporary victory for her, but the damage was very real. I had 46 freight trucks on the road across 3 states. I had warehouse staff, fuel accounts, and independent contractors expecting payment by Friday. Without access to our operating capital, the logistics chain would collapse within days. I spent the entire afternoon liquidating my personal savings, pulling from a high-yield emergency fund, and taking a massive penalty on an early retirement withdrawal just to cover payroll and diesel. It was a staggering financial hit, a real and painful cost to my own hard-earned stability, but I refused to let my employees suffer because of my family's toxicity. By Tuesday afternoon, the reality of the situation had settled into a grim routine of damage control. I was reviewing manually printed manifests when the front security desk buzzed my phone. The guard said my cousin Chloe was in the lobby, demanding to see me. I told him to send her back. I expected tears, or perhaps a sudden realization of what her mother had done. I should have known better. Chloe walked into my office wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a leather tote bag that cost more than my warehouse manager made in a month. She didn't sit down. She paced the length of my office, her voice trembling not with remorse, but with pure, distilled outrage. She told me her mother's bank accounts were completely locked, meaning the travel agency had cancelled her luxury honeymoon to the Maldives. She looked at me as if I had personally destroyed her life. She demanded that I call the bank, drop the ridiculous fraud allegations, and pay the vendors so she could get on her flight. I sat back in my chair and observed her. There was a time when I would have felt a reflex of guilt, a trained instinct to fix the problem, to keep the peace. But that mechanism had broken permanently on Saturday night in the catering kitchen. I calmly asked Chloe if she knew where the $85,000 from her new in-laws had gone. She rolled her eyes, insisting her mother had put it toward the floral arrangements and the venue deposit. I pulled up a printed copy of the public property records and pushed it across my desk. I told her to look at the date and the cash purchase price of her mother's new coastal condominium. Chloe glanced at the paper, and for a fraction of a second, the entitlement faltered. The math was impossible to ignore, but instead of confronting the truth of her mother's theft, she doubled down on the delusion. She pushed the paper back, claiming it was an investment for their family's future, and that I was still responsible for the wedding because I had promised to take care of them after her father died. I realized then that Chloe was not a victim of Diane's manipulation. She was a willing participant in the ecosystem of entitlement. I told her to leave my office and never come back. I told her the next time she wanted to speak to me, she could do it through my corporate attorneys. She stormed out, slamming the glass door so hard the frames rattled. Her visit, however, triggered a critical realization. Chloe had mentioned the floral arrangements and the venue deposit being handled directly by her mother. But Silas, the catering captain, had explicitly told me on Saturday night that all vendor coordination was supposed to be handled by a professional event planner. If Diane was claiming that I had authorized the shadow email domain, the event planner would be the central node of communication. The planner would have the digital trail of who actually gave the orders, who negotiated the prices, and most importantly, the IP addresses of the daily correspondence. I needed the planner's unedited communication logs before Diane's lawyer could subpoena them and bury them in discovery. I left the warehouse and drove across the city to a high-end commercial district. The event planning firm, a boutique agency called Luminary Events, occupied a sleek storefront with frosted glass windows. I walked in and asked to speak to the lead coordinator for the Reed wedding. The receptionist looked terrified at the mention of the name and told me the coordinator, a woman named Sarah, had taken a sudden leave of absence on Monday morning. That detail shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. People do not take sudden leaves of absence the day after a massive corporate fraud is exposed, unless they are either complicit or terrified. I drove back to my truck, my mind working through the variables. If Sarah was complicit, Diane's lawyer would already be protecting her. But if she was terrified, it meant she knew something that contradicted Diane's official narrative. I didn't need to break into a server to find out. I needed someone who knew the invisible mechanics of the hospitality industry. I needed someone who noticed everything, but was paid to be invisible. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the Ironworks venue management, navigating the automated directory until I reached the service kitchens. I asked for Silas. When he picked up, the background noise was a familiar symphony of clattering pans and yelling line cooks. I didn't waste his time. I asked him what he knew about Sarah, the event planner. Silas was quiet for a long moment. He told me that he shouldn't be talking to me, that the venue management was in a panic over the unpaid invoices. I reminded him that I was the only person actively trying to prove who actually owed them the money. Silas let out a heavy sigh. He told me to meet him at a diner near the shipyard at midnight after his shift ended. He said there was something about the way the contracts were handled that had been bothering him for months, a discrepancy in the supply deliveries that he had tried to flag, but that Sarah had aggressively shut down. It wasn't just a matter of forged signatures, it was a matter of physical logistics. And if there is one thing I understand better than anyone else in this city, it is the uncompromising reality of physical logistics. I arrived at the diner just before midnight. It was a brightly lit, sterile box, humming with the sound of old refrigerators, smelling faintly of bleach and old frying oil. Silas was already sitting in a corner booth, nursing a cup of tea. He looked out of place without his immaculate catering uniform, wearing a heavy wool sweater and looking every bit of his 60 years. He didn't have his usual clipboard, but resting on the Formica table was a thick, rubber-banded stack of carbon copy delivery manifests. I slid into the booth opposite him. Silas didn't waste time with small talk. He pushed the stack across the table. He explained that something had been bothering him for the last 3 months of the wedding preparation. The volume of goods ordered through the central vendor portal did not match the physical volume of goods arriving at the Ironworks loading docks. Diane had authorized massive supplemental purchases, cases of vintage Bordeaux, high-end imported patio furniture billed as lounge rentals, and custom landscape lighting billed as event decor. Silas had flagged the missing inventory with Sarah, the event planner, assuming there had been a logistical error. Sarah had aggressively shut him down, telling him the client was managing those specific deliveries off-site and to mind his own kitchen. I pulled the rubber band off the stack and began flipping through the manifests. Silas pointed a calloused finger at the routing codes at the bottom of the pages. The vendor portal had billed the items to Talbot Logistics, but the final mile delivery routing was entirely different. They were not sent to the shipyard. I looked at the destination address. It was the exact street address of Diane's new luxury coastal condominium. My aunt had not just stolen my company's credit line to pay for a wedding. She had used the wedding as a financial smokescreen to furnish and stock her newly purchased home, funneling tens of thousands of dollars in physical assets through the event planner's vendor network. This was why Sarah had vanished. She had facilitated the redirection of the goods, likely taking a cut or submitting to Diane's threats to keep the account. This was the fatal flaw in Diane's strategy. Her high-priced lawyer was building a defense entirely around digital ambiguity, arguing about IP addresses, shadow domains, and verbal authorizations. But I run a freight logistics company. I know better than anyone that while you can forge an email and manipulate a digital ledger, you cannot fake the physical mass of a commercial delivery. You cannot make 2 tons of furniture and wine disappear into the cloud. The next morning, I did not go to a lawyer's office. I went to the regional dispatch hub of the final mile freight carrier listed on Silas's manifests. I know the terminal manager there. We have traded routes and overflow capacity for a decade. I showed him the tracking numbers. Within 20 minutes, he pulled the encrypted telematics data from the delivery trucks, along with the digitized, time-stamped proof of delivery signatures. Diane had personally signed for every single piece of stolen freight at her condominium's loading bay. The climax did not happen in a crowded courtroom, and it did not involve a screaming match. It happened on a Thursday morning in the sterile wood-paneled chambers of a county judge during the emergency injunction hearing. I sat at a heavy oak table with David, my CFO, and Ian, the underwriter's investigator. Diane sat across from us, wearing a conservative navy suit, looking supremely confident. Her lawyer, a man who charged $1,000 an hour, began delivering a polished, aggressive monologue about family disputes, corporate misunderstandings, and my supposed malicious intent. I let him speak for 5 uninterrupted minutes. Then, I slid a bound folder across the table to the judge. I didn't argue about the emails. I simply directed the judge to the freight telematics, the GPS coordinates of the delivery trucks, the itemized manifests, and the wet ink digital signatures Diane had provided at her own front door to receive goods paid for by Talbot Logistics. I explained that while the defendant was claiming a misunderstanding over wedding costs, she was actively sitting on $40,000 of stolen physical assets in her living room. The silence in the judge's chambers was absolute. I watched Diane's lawyer open his copy of the folder. I watched his eyes scan the GPS logs and the delivery signatures. The arrogance evaporated from his face, replaced instantly by the cold, calculated self-preservation of a man who realizes his client has lied to him and led him into defending a federal crime. He closed the folder, slowly pushed his chair back, and formally requested a recess to confer with his client. The judge did not grant a recess. He looked at the physical evidence, looked at Diane's pale, trembling face, and immediately lifted the freeze on my company's operating accounts. He then picked up his phone and requested an agent from the District Attorney's Economic Crimes Division to step into his chambers. The fallout was swift and structurally devastating for Diane. Because physical fraud had been proven, the state moved to seize the condominium as proceeds of a crime. The groom's wealthy family, realizing their $85,000 contribution had been used to facilitate corporate embezzlement, immediately hired their own crisis management firm. They distanced themselves entirely, initiating a quiet, brutal annulment process for Chloe, erasing the social elevation Diane had sacrificed everything to achieve. Sarah, the event planner, surfaced 2 days later, turning over all of her unedited communication logs to the authorities in a desperate bid for immunity. I did not stick around to watch Diane get arrested. I did not visit her, and I did not answer the dozens of frantic, tearful voicemails Chloe left on my phone, begging for financial help now that her husband's family had cut her off. The impulse to rescue them, the generational guilt that had dictated my choices for a decade, was completely gone, burned away by the cold reality of the paperwork. A month later, the winter had fully set in. I arrived at my warehouse at 5 in the morning on a Tuesday. The heating system was humming, fighting against the freezing temperatures outside. I walked into the break room, poured a cup of bitter industrial-grade coffee into a ceramic mug, and walked out onto the elevated steel catwalk overlooking the primary loading bays. Below me, the massive rolling doors were open to the dark morning. The yellow lights of the forklifts cut through the exhaust, loading pallets of legitimate, cleanly manifested freight onto my trucks. I stood there alone, feeling the steady vibration of the engines vibrating through the steel grates beneath my boots, watching the machinery of my own life move exactly as it was supposed to.